Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Luohan Webinar. Today we are very excited to have Professor Gerry Tsoukalas. Gerry Tsoukalas is Associate Professor at Boston University and a Senior Fellow of the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, and a Research Fellow of the Cornell University's FinTech Initiative and a Fellow of the Luohan Academy. In addition to his established academic career, he has also worked with a variety of firms and startups, including PayPal, Forest Park, and Moody's. He is currently serving as Associate Editor of Management Science and Manufacturing and Service Operations and Management. Professor Tsoukalas' research examines how to manage and design new technology platforms, particularly in the blockchain and the fintech areas. His papers were also published at leading peer-reviewed journals. And today he's going to talk about his new paper, the pricing control and the regulation on online service platforms. Professor Tsoukalas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for joining and for the invitation. It's really a wonderful webinar series that the Luohan Academy has been putting on for a while now. I'm really honored to be a part of this. So I would like to share some relatively recent work that I've been doing on pricing control and regulation for platforms. And this is joint work with Gerard Cachon and Tolga Dizdar, who are both at Wharton. So to kick things off, let me spend just a few minutes to motivate why we are interested in this question. And there are really two main reasons. The first one is simply that there's variation in practice. So if you look at different platforms like Airbnb, for instance, which is the first one here, well, they let their service providers, so people that have apartments and houses to put up, they let them set their own fares and they provide a little bit of guidance. But you can ignore that if you want. And other platforms like Uber really prefer to keep pricing control centrally. At least for the most part. We'll see in just a few minutes, it's not 100% the case. So anytime there's variation of business models in practice, a natural question for academics is why is this happening? So what's driving this? Now, the second reason, or the second set of reasons, is that these platforms are currently experiencing different types of disruptions, and there's at least two of them that we're going to really focus on today. One is on the technology side and one is on the regulation side. And these two things are causing them to re-examine their business models. So let's dive into this for a few minutes just to talk about what's going on. So first, the technology side, we have this pretty large growth in blockchain-based startups that are kind of coming to the table with drastically different business models. And you can see some quotes here from news outlets talking about these various startups, probably focus on the one on the top here by Forbes, which is basically saying that blockchain could kill Uber altogether. And there are similar quotes about a startup called Arcade City down here. And the business models of these startups, you can imagine it's quite interesting, quite different from what we're used to. But I don't want to get lost in the details, at this stage of the talk, and just say at a high level, what are they promising? How are they going to, quotation marks, kill Uber? Well, one of the main ways is by disintermediating and decentralizing. And what does that mean? Well, it basically means that you somehow remove the middleman, right? So Uber in this case from the picture, and you give more autonomy to the servers. So when I say servers, today it'll mean drivers or basically service providers. So you can give more autonomy to make their own decisions, including deciding their own prices, but also you give back more value to them and to the customers of the platform. Right? So it's a really simple concept. If there's no one to take commission, then that extra value can go to the users of the system. Now, just to tie this back to, to the question that I'm going to talk about today, pricing is a relevant decision that these startups have to make. And if they're going to be successful, it's actually a critical decision in terms of, how do you actually implement these systems if you try to take out Uber from, an Uber-like platform from the, the picture. So that's on the technology side. Let me say a few words on the regulation side, because there's a lot going on there. This can be considered a second source of disruption. And there's a longstanding debate between regulators in different countries and platforms like Uber and Airbnb on the classification of platform workers. So typically, these platforms treat workers as independent contractors, and this allows them to bypass some costs and other obligations that they might otherwise have. And regulators in many countries have been pressuring them to reclassify the workers as employees instead. Right? So if you do that, then worker, you have to pay some benefits. It's generally speaking, the consensus that it's much more costly to classify your workers as employees. How does this connect back to the study? Well, it turns out the main legal argument, or one of the main legal arguments that's being used by the regulators, is that these platforms are exerting too much control over the workforce, including control of prices. So it's a simple argument. If you're not letting them set their own prices, how could they possibly be independent contractors? So as you can imagine, these platforms are pushing back with a really simple counter argument that basically says, if you force us to reclassify all these workers, you're going to drive us out of business and everyone's going to lose. Okay, so this is really a global issue, and it has important consequences, I would say, for millions of gig economy workers. And I just want to give you a sense of where things are, where they were a few months ago. So last year in the UK, the Supreme Court ruled that drivers need to be reclassified. They can't be independent contractors. And this quote from Forbes here called this an existential threat to the business model of these platforms. And there are similar quotes in different countries in Europe, but a precursor to a lot of this started in California, actually, back in 2019, where there was this new bill called Assembly Bill 5, which is AB5 for short, that was passed into law. And this essentially was saying, to firms like Uber and Lyft, you have to reclassify all your California drivers as employees. Right, so you can imagine that the platforms didn't just sit there after this bill passed. So they did something, and let's zoom in a little bit. Let me take a few more minutes to talk about Uber's response, because I think it's quite telling. So Uber tried to do two things. On the left and right are the two different things that it tried to do. On the left side, it actually tried to decentralize its pricing, which means give full control of pricing to the drivers. And you can see the picture here. Drivers can set their own fares. The way they do that is they set a fare multiplier. And there might be some limits on that, but essentially they have almost full control over the prices that they set in California. So this was an update to the app. So that was one thing. And this is quite surprising that they would even try to do this in many ways. But at the same time, in parallel, right, they also tried to dismantle AB5, this regulation, by creating a superseding proposition, Proposition 22, that would essentially allow them to be exempt from the requirement imposed by AB5. And they threw about $200 million to get this bill passed, and it did. Actually, they were successful. It actually did pass after many, many months. So at this point, it might not be too surprising what Uber did next, right? As soon as this bill passed, with respect to their decentralized pricing experiment, a few months after that, in April 2021, they revoked the policy that let California drivers set their own fares. And this is a quote from the Daily Mail. It's being quite aggressive. It's basically saying that the only reason they did decentralized pricing to begin with was to dodge this AB5 regulation. It's like, well, you can't claim that we don't let drivers control their own prices. Look what we're doing in California. They control their own prices, right? So let me wrap up the motivation here. And I want to connect all this back to the study, to the original question of pricing control. And let's look at some of the lessons that were learned from this really interesting decentralized pricing experiment. So on the top here, the first thing to note is that when the original policy in California was announced and implemented, drivers were actually pretty happy, at least according to the news articles. But a lot of experts, including many academics, were criticizing the decision with a really basic argument, They were just saying, look, decentralized pricing is a disaster because it's going to lead to a race to the bottom. It's basically a Bertrand price competition type of argument where, you know, prices get pushed down as drivers are competing against each other fiercely, and, you know, a lot of drivers drop out as a result of that because they can't compete with the lowest cost drivers. So it's a Bertrand style type of unraveling argument that you know, people were fearing. And what's more interesting on the bottom here is what Uber claims. So the official reason they gave for taking back control of pricing after the experiment was that drivers were choosing prices that were actually too high. So the opposite of that. And what that, at least if you take the press release at its word, it caused customers to drop out, to leave the platform altogether, and to join other platforms and basically not come back to Uber. So I'm going to put this in quotation. I'm going to call this race to the top, which is not really a thing, but just to contrast to this race to the bottom idea. So when I say race to the top, I mean Uber's the results that Uber presented, with prices kind of going much higher than is ideal. So, you know, both of these scenarios actually sound plausible, but also contradictory, right? So which one should we believe can both happen, and how can both happen? Right, so from a research perspective, we thought there was a lot of interesting stuff here, starting with the main question, you know, how should platforms decide between centralized and decentralized pricing? And to figure this out, we took a game theory approach in the paper that's attached to this talk. Now, we don't necessarily have to limit ourselves to this choice between centralized and decentralized. You can think of, is there some sort of hybrid structure that you could take, or other pricing structures? And so, of course, part of the study in this paper is going beyond that. You know, what can we do to existing contracts to kind of improve them further? And if I have time towards the end, I could say a few words about, you know, is blockchain going to kill Uber, or at least what are some of the things that it depends on. Right, so are there any questions so far? I could pause for just a little bit.
Well, yeah, I can definitely understand the simple logic of the race to the bottom, but can you briefly explain what's some logic of the race to the top?
Sure.
Clearly.
Yeah, so I don't know what the logic is, but this was, empirically speaking, what Uber claimed that they saw, right? So the logic is that drivers were setting prices that were too high. And so what could explain this from an economics perspective? If you're a driver, if you don't think you have a lot of competition, you might want to set your price, you know, high, basically. But if all drivers are thinking the same way, you know, customers as a whole, they observe high prices on average, and they might prefer to take an outside option instead.
Okay. So this is just like a Uber said what happened.
Yes, it's the official reason they gave. They didn't mention Proposition 22 passing, but they said, look, we have to stop this experiment. I think it was running for about a year. So it's not a trivial amount of time. So we have to stop the experiment because it's not working. Customers are leaving the platform.
Okay, yeah, super interesting.
Sorry, can I clarify, what are the drivers setting? Are they setting their unit prices, or are they setting, do they have more granularity on what they're setting in terms of their routes?
They're setting the prices that they charge to customers on a per unit basis.
And so it sounds like what that implies is if they set that on per unit basis, there are going to be some routes that are using that per unit price going to be more profitable. And then Uber only assigns them those routes. Okay,
yes.
Understood.
Yeah.
I've always heard anecdotally from drivers, you know, they love to go to the airport, right? They love longer routes.
Yes.
So I guess they can use the unit price to ensure that they get those routes. Understood.
Yes, they had so it was done in stages, right? Initially, they had only a little bit of control, and as months were passing, from what I've read, they were given more and more control to completely set their own fares.
Thank you.
And also,
right.
Can I ask one question regarding the race to bottom? Well, I'm not sure why the race to bottom is the problem, or for for this service? Because usually if there's a virtual competition, the price will be lower, the consumer welfare will be higher. But in this context, maybe that too fierce price competition can drive out drivers. Is that the concept?
Yes,
okay.
That's right. But also there's the driver welfare as well. And
okay.
so one of the main problems in the gig economy throughout the world is that they're not making enough money.
Okay.
Especially when you take into account they don't have all the benefits that an employee has on top of that.
All right.
Yeah, so let me actually tell you what we get. So I'm going to summarize the whole paper in just this one slide, so that in theory after this, this is really the core of the talk. So on the question of how firms should decide between these two, centralized and decentralized pricing. So in this paper, we identify one key trade-off. Now there might be others, but one of the key things that platforms need to deal with is under centralized pricing is that they can't directly observe server costs, including opportunity costs. It's not just the cost of operating a vehicle or an asset, but it's the opportunity costs. Do I want to work this weekend or not? And so just as in standard theory, when you can't observe something, it creates frictions and it can reduce value in the overall system. Now, this friction can be eliminated if you use decentralized pricing. And it's simple. It's just that the servers can set prices that are tailored to their individual circumstances, right? Their individual opportunity costs and real costs. And that's a possible advantage of decentralization in this setting. But if you do decentralize, it has its own problems. And this is coming from a loss of coordination on the platform. So we're going to call this coordination inefficiencies in this paper. And in brief, and we're going to get into the details of this, these are due to destructive competition effects that can occur, similar to these quotes of race to the top, race to the bottom that we talked about earlier. Now, which of these types of inefficiencies is worse depends on the type of competition and the degree of competition in the market, at least in this paper. And it's going to depend on two types of competition that we call at the server level versus the platform level. So on these platforms, there are these two effects that are going on at the same time. If you do decentralize, drivers compete against each other, but there's an overall level of prices on the platform. And if this overall level is too high, customers might drop out and go somewhere else, prefer their outside option. So it's going to depend on these two things. And the main takeaway is that either of them can actually prevail, which means that neither is robust when the nature of competition in the market changes. It could change in the, every day or every week, et cetera. And, a prescription here would be, well, on the days that it makes sense to do centralized, and the days that it makes sense to decentralize, do that. But obviously that's not practical nor realistic for platforms to be able to switch their policies depending on, how the markets are on a given day. And so to go, one step beyond that, is there something we can do? And so we adopt a mechanism design approach down here. And I'll show you towards the end that it actually turns out that a really simple linear contract that combines commissions that platforms use with a per unit fee can actually enable full decentralization without any loss.
Excuse me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, hello.
Yes, hi there. May I ask a question? So when we are talking about the optimal pricing mechanism, what is the goal here? Is the goal maximize the profit of the platform, maximize the welfare of the consumers and the gig workers? What's the goal to achieve when we set that mechanism?
Yes, great question. So I'll show the model in just a little bit, but we take different perspectives. So the main perspective is from the platform's perspective. In this case, it would be to either maximize profit or maximize throughput. Some of the smaller platforms, they're trying to get volume instead of profits at the beginning. So the results aren't sensitive to that. And we also take the perspective of a central planner or a blockchain-based system that would remove the intermediary later on in the talk. So we explore both of these perspectives. Okay, so these are the results, and let's dive into how we get them. Just quickly, the literature review. So there's a lot of literature, and I kind of grouped it into these three areas. This is an older literature on pricing control within supply chains. So it's not directly related to platforms, but there's some interesting insights here when there's information asymmetry and things like that. Then a slightly newer literature on management of service platforms. But they haven't looked at decentralized pricing here. They looked at other types of decisions. And a very new literature here, which is decentralized platforms, including blockchain platforms. There are some studies here on pricing control, but none of them have really looked at what an optimal contract could look like, basically. So that's where this paper contributes. So let's move to the model. And to help keep track of things, I'm using some color. So everything in blue, for instance, here is going to be variables that are decisions that one party controls. And everything in red is going to be an endogenous quantity, an equilibrium quantity, and everything in black is just exogenous. So let's start up here. So the model considers a large number of small servers. So they can't, so what does small mean? It means they can't influence the aggregate outcome, although they are aware that there is an aggregate outcome. They have a private cost C, and which is for now just a uniform distribution between 0 and 1, and then it's relaxed in the paper. And in terms of the decisions, they're quite simple. So when we have a centralized game, these servers only decide whether to enter or not enter. If we have a decentralized pricing game where the platform decides to decentralize, and they also decide their prices on top of their entry decisions. So I'll show you a timeline of how these, when these decisions are made in a couple of slides. So those are the servers, and then the platform does not observe server costs. And in terms of the decisions, so in the centralized game, it chooses the commission fee. We're going to just look at standard commission contracts that most of these platforms use. And it also chooses a platform price P. In the decentralized game, it chooses just the commission fee because the platform price is now in the hands of the servers. So those are kind of some of the main ingredients of the model, but the core of the model and kind of some of the innovation here is in this slide here, which is the customer demand function. And we spent a lot of time to try to come up with something simple that can capture these two types of competitions that I mentioned earlier. So so this is Q of C as a function of costs, is how much an individual driver or server, how much demand they get. And there are really two components driving it. So the first effect here is competition at the platform level, but we don't want to model real competition between multiple platforms. It's too complicated. So what we do here is we leverage the average price across the platform, which is P bar. And so the idea is that if the average price is high, then customers are going to go somewhere else. So your demand shrinks. So there's a negative beta, and how much, sensitivity to this effect is parameter beta. So this is pretty standard term in demand models. The second term is a little bit less standard, which is the competition between the servers themselves. And this is really only going to matter in the decentralized setting. One of the difficulties in trying to model competition between servers is that customers might care about other things outside of price, but we don't want to overcomplicate the model, and to try and keep things tractable, what we do here is we again leverage the average price, and the idea is really simple. If a server sets a price P of C after observing their cost, less than the average market, the average platform price that happens in equilibrium, so this is an endogenous quantity, then they expect to gain a little bit of demand. And if you flip that, if they set prices higher than what the average platform price is, they lose some demand. And so the intensity of that effect is this parameter gamma. And so these are the two parameters that are really going to drive all the results. Beta is how sensitive are customers to the overall platform price, and gamma is how sensitive customers are to variations in pricing between the different servers. So, this is a relatively simple linear model. It's similar to the classical Cournot setting if it wasn't for this, extra term here, and the fact that we're leveraging the average price. And so that I have to say a few words about, what is the average platform price? Well, you can compute it with this, formula here. And what I'm doing here is I'm actually weighting by the quantities that end up being served in the market. For a variety of reasons, technical reasons, but also practical reasons. What we wanted to do here is to actually eliminate situations where drivers could play with prices, meaning, imagine posting a price that's very low, but then canceling it right away and not actually going through with it. So, this is the definition of the average platform price. And one thing you'll notice here is that we're integrating over all possible drivers. So as a reminder, they're uniformly distributed between 0 and 1 in terms of costs, but there might be a cap, meaning that not all drivers may want to participate or may find it profitable to participate. And so this cap, C hat, which is the marginal driver above which drivers with higher costs will not want to join the market. And this itself is as endogenous as well, which is why it's in red. Right. So that's it. Those are the ingredients, right? So we have a demand model, and then we have these two sets of players, the platform and the servers. And that's basically it. But all of this, this is going to drive really everything. So let's jump to the analysis. I'm going to talk quickly about what we get with this model in the centralized setting, decentralized setting, and then really the interesting part is 3 is let's try to compare the two results. So the timeline first here is really simple. Platform. So this is the centralized game. So the platform sets a price P and a fee. The servers observe these parameters, they observe their costs, and then they make participation decisions. It's not a very complicated game. And in terms of the math, and hopefully this will make things a little bit simpler. So from the platform's perspective, they can't distinguish between servers because they can't observe the costs. So they set a single price P for a given market at a given point in time. And this really simplifies the demand model because the average price is just the price that's set by the platform. And then from the server's perspective, their profit function is simple. They have some demand, which is coming from the customer demand model, and they have a unit profit. So what is the unit profit? It's the price that the platform decides to set minus the cost, but there's also a commission fee that they have to pay to the platform, which is fee. And so when this thing binds, right, you get the marginal server, the server with the highest possible cost that could participate in this market. Any server with a cost higher than this is not profitable to participate. So the optimization problem from the platform's perspective is also pretty straightforward. So the platform is maximizing commission, which is the price times the commission fee, times aggregate demand. So you integrate over all possible servers that do decide to join, so that are below C hat, and the platform controls P and fee. And so we have this two-dimensional optimization problem with fee and P, and C hat, which also contains fee and P up here. So it's actually a very well-defined problem, and we get very nice closed form solutions. And I don't want to spend too much time, but with this uniform assumption, you get very, very simple forms. So this is the optimal price that the platform should set. This is the commission takes, about 50%. How many servers enter, the average market price, total quantity that's served. You get all these interesting things that you might care about here. Everything in closed form. Now, I don't want to spend much time because what I want to do is compare the two. So let me talk about the decentralized setting. And here, all we've done is take the pricing decision, which was here, and moved it here. That's the only difference. It's in the hands of the servers. So this is what the optimization problem looks like now. This is from the server's perspective. The profit function is the same as before, except it's a maximization problem now. Every single server maximizes over their pricing policy, PFC. There's this demand model that dictates how much demand they get as a function of the price they set, but also as a function of the average price, which depends on the actions of every other server, basically. So that's the server optimization problem. And then this is the platform's optimization problem. It's similar as before, except it only controls the commission fee now, because the prices are under the control of the servers. And so it takes the server's prices as given, right? It anticipates the prices that are going to be set and then maximizes over its commission fee. So it's more complicated, right, to solve this in the decentralized setting. But nonetheless, there still are closed form solutions, and they're in the middle column here. So this is the optimal price that every server sets as a function of the cost they observe. The commission of the platform is still the same, funny enough, but everything else changes. And the main difference, so what's going on between these two things? Well, when you decentralize, you have to worry about server competition, which is reflected by this gamma term. And so the higher the gamma, the more intense the server competition, and the lower the gamma, the less intense the server competition. Now, everything is closed form, so it's easy to compare, but I think the best way to do it is just visually. What's going on with these two models? So let me just give you what I think is a really simple graph to kind of make things concrete. So here, just ignore the label here. This is just the platform's profit. Okay, just the platform's total profit as a function of the market. And when I say the market, I'm really going to focus on this internal competition parameter, gamma, fixing the other one, beta, to some value, and then making gamma vary. And the black line is centralized pricing. So if you remember, centralized pricing is not sensitive to competition between servers, because there is none. The platform basically can eliminate that by setting the price itself. So that's why it's flat here. It doesn't depend on gamma, and I've normalized it to 1. So this is the profits under centralized pricing normalized to 1. What happens with decentralized pricing? So you get these two or 3 areas that are interesting. So first of all, you're worse off, then you're better off, and then you're worse off again if you decentralize. So when gamma is very small, either when there's too little competition or too much competition between the servers themselves, and you decentralize, it leads to terrible outcomes. Basically, the market crash. So you get these race to the bottom, race to the top effects that I'll comment in a minute. But in the middle, you get a boost because you're overcoming information asymmetry. And so decentralized pricing can actually outperform centralized pricing. So I'm going to pause here, yes, for questions.
Oh yeah, can you go back one?
Go back, yeah.
Yeah, so in a decentralized server price, so it's a C plus some term. So it means that every server will join in this case.
So not every server joins. You have the cutoff is here, it's C hat. So every server with cost 0 to C hat joins. And so also the volume, the supply side of the market is different, and it can be either, well, it depends on beta and gamma, basically.
Okay.
So in some markets, you might have more people joining or less people joining.
May I ask a clarifying question?
Yes, of course.
So you mentioned earlier that Uber had this interesting experiment of allowing decentralized pricing for some period. Do we know any evidence on that? what exactly happens. Like I would think that thinking about what would happen if there are decentralized pricing. Is it too much competition, or is it just too costly to negotiate each contract? Will that lead to the reduction of the total activities and reduce the revenue and profits for the whole thing, platform, or is it too much competition? And then what do you think is most likely result? Do they have some empirical evidence on that? That the Uber statement that is price too high seems to me that it's just inefficient negotiation with prices or that. What's your take on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had the data, but it's a private data and I don't have it. So as far as I know, they haven't shared it, but I could be wrong. Anecdotally, right? So my knowledge of this, because I don't have access to the data, is based on the press releases from Uber, but also based on various media outlets that were covering the story. It was a pretty popular story at the time because there was disagreement about whether this is good or bad for drivers. Anecdotally, drivers love this option, right? And it makes sense. Even behaviorally, you have a sense of freedom, right? So now, why did they set prices that were too high? Well, there are multiple explanations. One is that their costs were high, and if they can better observe their costs, they have to set prices that are higher. The other is that there's lack of perceived competition. And so if you're a driver, you don't really know what the state of the market is. So you have to guess, right? And maybe you're optimistic, you set prices that are a little bit too high. I didn't see a lot of press releases saying that prices were low and that was good for customers. I didn't see a lot of that. So my inclination is, but keep in mind, I don't have access to the data. My inclination is that what Uber said happened probably happened. At least over the course of this 1 year, I'm sure that there were days where this happened, but maybe not the whole year, right? Yeah.
So I guess my interest here is what's the key assumption you should make in your modeling here? So what should we really care about when there's decentralized pricing? Is it because a lot more competition, or is it just that inefficient pricing mechanism, or whatever it is? And how will that affect the results?
Yeah, so for this model is really simple. It doesn't have a lot of bells and whistles. It really just has these two parameters, beta and gamma. And it's really gamma, which is how much competition is there between the drivers. So the way to interpret the results is if there are no other drivers around, right? We're down here. And in this case, drivers, they don't see anyone else. So they set prices that are much higher than what the platform would want or what customers want. And in this case, when there's too much competition, you have this race to the bottom effect. Maybe it's instructive to, I don't know, I have actually some slides to answer this question in more depth. But before I get to them, are there any other questions?
Yeah, I have one regarding this figure. I think for those kinds of like Uber or Lyft, they can actually control this gamma, right? So if they can control this gamma using their recommendation mechanism or like a matching mechanism, then in that case, the optimal choice would be select intermediate gamma and decentralized pricing from this figure, right? Why we don't observe that in the reality?
Well, so it's a good observation. I don't know, but the question is how possible is it for them to control gamma directly, right? So that gamma meaning how sensitive. So you have to understand this is a customer demand model, so we don't have a utility function here, but it says how sensitive are customers to price variations between different drivers if you let drivers set their own prices. So it's not
still the match is the match between like a driver and consumer is driven by the platform, right? So they can.
So absolutely, and this is a really interesting situation because the original experiment didn't do any additional controls. Right? It was basically you set your own fares. What the only thing they did do is indicate where the market is by giving an indication of where Uber would have priced if it was up to them to price. And as a driver, you can ignore that information or use it, right? So they didn't do any extra control, but you have to also keep in mind that the problem when implementing controls is that you run into that regulatory wall. So the more control you exert over your workers, the stronger the argument that regulators can make, at least in some countries, say, well, actually, you're exerting too much control. So the control was not just on pricing, it was just general control on scheduling and other things like that, including what rides a driver can accept, not accept. And so there's this tension that we don't explore in the paper, this really interesting tension between what you ideally want to do as a platform, but also how that interacts with the regulatory environment that you're operating in. But I think you're right. The answer here, and that's kind of one of the answers in the paper is, well, you shouldn't be scared of decentralized pricing if you can do it the right way. And the right way is not just letting people set their prices as they see fit. You need a little bit more than that. So that's going to be the conclusion.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess to go back to the previous question, we can dive into some of the curves. So what's going on at the peak? It's a special case, but at the peak, basically the gamma equals beta, and this average price cancels out. You end up with this simple demand function, which is just a monopoly function. So every driver is basically similar to a monopoly, and in this case, you can extract the maximum wealth from the customers. But it's an edge case, so it's not expected to happen. So what's more interesting is what happens when gamma is big or when gamma is small, and in particular when it's bigger than beta and less than beta. Now, this is a little bit involved. There's some arguments here, but basically behind the scenes, what's going on is that in this regime, when there's a lot of server competition, this demand function that every server is facing ends up net increasing with the average price across the platform. And this is really a standard retail setting. So if you think about these two lemonade stands, if let's say you're the one on the left, well, if the other one starts increasing its price, in theory, you should be able to capture more customers because the price differential, goes up, and maybe customers might be willing to drive longer to get to your lemonade stand if the price differential is justified. And so every server really would benefit by having kind of an increased price, but they can't coordinate because it's exactly the regime where there's too much competition. And so with small price differences, you can capture market share from another driver. And at the extreme case, when gamma goes to infinity, what is this? Well, it's basically customers are infinitely sensitive to a tiny variation in prices. If the next server has a 1 cent difference, I don't care if I need to wait, an hour, I'm going to go for that one. And this collapses the whole thing, the whole model to a Bertrand setting. And what happens there is that because there are servers with zero cost, right, everyone drops out. So the whole game unravels, and you end up that there's really very little supply in the market because no one can really afford to compete with the low cost servers.
Sorry, is there a capacity constraint?
So there's no capacity in this model, but and when you do add a capacity constraint, what it does is it dampens this effect, but it doesn't make it disappear, right? And it's understandable. So there's an extension in the paper that looks at capacity constraints, and it does mitigate this problem, but it doesn't disappear completely.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. So you get that classical effect when gamma is bigger than beta, the classical Bertrand effect, and when gamma is less than beta, you get the opposite effect that we're talking about in the experiment. So here, everything is reversed. So demand is decreasing with the average platform price, and this is a picture to capture that. So imagine a platform like Uber competing with a platform like taxi. The customer chooses between the two, but doesn't care about price variations within the platform between different drivers. And so everything is reversed here. When gamma goes to 0, there is no competition. So a customer accepts any price that's given once they've joined the platform. And in this case, drivers set prices that are too high, so customers don't want to join the platform to begin with. And so in this case, you have a lot of drivers, but no customers. And so you have this race to the top type of effect. So, the details are also, there's some details in the paper, but basically what I think is interesting here, just to get out of the weeds a little bit. So here's the model. There's not a lot of behavioral considerations going on here. It's really just these two types of competition. There's competition at the platform level. There's competition between the drivers. These two things are interacting with each other, and together they dictate overall customer demand that a given driver sees. And these two effects suffice to create these race to the top, race to the bottom effects, right? So a classical Cournot model would not be able, to replicate this without taking into account, competition between the drivers. So I think that's what's interesting here, is that we actually get these two things without having to resort to behavioral utility functions and things like that. And at a higher level, there are some strategy implications that are somewhat straightforward. So when competition is out of whack, right? So as you don't have enough drivers, you have too many drivers, it's better for the platform to take control. Now, the second takeaway, I think, is probably even more important. One, centralized can be better than decentralized and vice versa, depending on many things, but in this paper, depending on competition, the nature of competition, which can shift during the day. And you can't switch from one pricing method to another pricing method on the fly. It's not possible. It's too costly. It's too difficult to do. And so what do? Well, in the paper, we take a mechanism design approach. That's what I'm going to talk about next. Which is, let's forget about the dichotomy. Let's explore the entire space of possible contracts. And if you're not familiar with mechanism design, just to quickly say, one of the main ideas is the revelation principle. It says that you can basically restrict the search for an optimal mechanism to the set of truth-inducing mechanisms, where servers just report their true costs to the platform, and you just have to ensure incentive compatibility, meaning that none of them wants to lie and misreport. It's not economically favorable for anyone to misreport. And so if we take this established framework, the platform offers a menu of contracts, and the servers report a cost. They get assigned a price, a quantity, and some fee. Here's what it looks like from a math perspective. I don't want to spend too much time because I'm running out of time as well. But this is the platform's problem, right? So it's now setting a fee, which I call W here, and its profit or its revenues is basically collecting, summing up all the fees across all the drivers that decide to join the platform. And these are the traditional incentive compatibility constraints that you find in, all mechanism design problems. This is just saying that a driver should not deviate, should not find it profitable to deviate by misreporting the cost C tilde when, their real cost is C. Now, the only twist here that's a little different than a standard mechanism design is that we have this P bar that's lurking, right? It's behind the scenes here because it's inside the demand function, and it's itself an endogenous term. So, we struggle a little bit here to come up with a nice solution methodology. We spent, quite a bit of time, but it turns out that you actually get closed form solutions for this as well, and they're given on the right here. So what do you get? Well, you get linear pricing, so linear in costs, but the coefficients are different than decentralized pricing, and obviously different than centralized. But the big change is really the fee. Right? So the fee you charge to a driver, a server cost C is quadratic. So it's quite different than this commission rate, which was just a constant here. And so visually, this is what happens. Right? So the black was centralized pricing, we saw it before. The blue was decentralized, we saw it before. And this optimal mechanism with a quadratic fee structure gives you the orange line. So what is it doing? It's basically able to shut down the coordination inefficiencies and extract the maximum wealth from the customers. Again, this is the platform's optimization problem. With that type of objective. It's about 20% increase. It's pretty significant from a revenue management perspective. Okay, so we have this optimal mechanism. It's a little bit abstract. What is it doing? How does it work? It's a little complicated because of this quadratic fee structure. What I did here, just to try and get a little bit of intuition, is to just plot it. So what are the different fees, the different drivers, with hypothetical costs between 0 and 0.5, how much would they be charged by the platform? And you get this blue curve here. Right, so depending on your cost as a driver, you have to pay different quantities to the platform. But what's interesting is this part here, that the fee can actually turn negative, which means that for some drivers, or some servers, the platform will have to subsidize them to join the market. And so, I think this is pretty interesting. Is this observed in practice? Not directly this way, I would say, but there is some sort of subsidization going on in general. Now, okay, so it's complicated. It's a combination of subsidies and fees to get this optimal contract. Is it implementable? Probably not in the way, this quadratic fee structures, I've never observed that in practice. And that's kind of a general criticism of mechanism design. You can get some abstract contracts that you don't see in practice because they're a little bit complicated sometimes. So we spent some time on this to try and see, can we replicate this thing, right? This quadratic fees optimal contract, can we replicate it in a simpler way?
But if the platform has to
Yes,
subsidize, for the subsidy thing, if the platform has to subsidize, why would they subsidize the ones with the smallest cost or lowest cost?
So they don't always do that. This is for a given gamma, right? So it depends on gamma and beta. That's why it's pretty complicated. You can see that these terms here, well, you can't see it here, but yeah, I probably had it on the next slide. But if gamma is high, you might not get this effect, or you might have the opposite effect. Okay, so it's pretty complex. There's a lot of possibility, or you might get situations where you don't subsidize anyone. In this case, low gamma, what does it mean? It means there's just not enough competition in the market. So you want to get more drivers in. The best way to do that is to get the low cost drivers because they can do lower prices, basically.
Well, would this situation reverse if we increase the gamma?
I think so.
Okay.
I know for sure that the subsidies go away. I don't know if it goes all the way to the other. I don't remember if it goes all the way to the other extreme where you actually subsidize high cost drivers. That might, I'm not entirely sure about that. It's possible though. It might be, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So what can we do in terms of finding a contract that's implementable? And because it's not realistic for drivers to report their costs. Right? That's just not going to happen in the real world. But what the platform can observe are the prices. And it turns out the prices are linear in cost. So prices are actually a good proxy for server costs in this type of setting. So using this kind of basic insight, at the end, it turns out that you can replicate fully, I mean exactly, the optimal contract when you implement this type of fee structure. So this is the optimal per customer fee that the platform charges to every server. And it's just going to, it cannot observe price, but it's going to observe, sorry, it cannot observe cost. It can observe price. And so if the server announces a price, as long as the platform can observe that price, it can set a fee that's linear in that price. Now, this is a slightly different fee. It's a per customer fee. So what does it look like? Well, it's the standard commission contract, except the commission rate reflects the market, reflects the internal versus external competition parameters. But you also need a fixed fee. It does not suffice to just have a commission fee. If you want to perfectly replicate, fully replicate the optimal contract. And you can see it's the same, it's going to have the same properties as here because it's just a replication, right? It gives you the exact same profits in equilibrium, but you can see here that these terms can turn negative. This fixed fee could turn into a subsidy if beta is bigger than gamma. The commission could turn negative as well. So it's a reverse commission type of thing. So it's complicated, but in terms of the structure I think is simple. It could be implemented as long as if you can observe gamma and beta, if you can observe competition live in the market. In theory, this could be implemented in a decentralized way. That's kind of the point here, is that all you need to do is to be able to observe prices. Once you observe prices, you can set the right fees, and you can fully decentralize the market and capture all the values that you could possibly capture. Okay, now that's great for the platform, but there's a welfare question here. So I'm almost out of time here. So from a welfare perspective, what's going on? Well, what we're doing here is that we're actually plotting the server profits, right, to look at the server welfare, depending on the type of pricing control. So blue is decentralized, black is centralized, and orange is this optimal mechanism. It's the optimal contract. Whether you do it, with a quadratic fee structure, or you do it in the way I showed in the previous slide, doesn't matter. You get the same result. And so what happens is, imagine you're centralized, you're in the black curve here, and the platform announces, well, I'm going to now switch to this, optimal contract, orange. Well, the servers that are, these low-cost servers in this case would get more profits. Right? So their profits go up, but these high-cost servers, their profits go down. Oh, sorry, no, they're both up in this case. If you compare to the decentralized curve, that's what can happen, right? So here, the blue curve is below the black curve. Here, the blue curve is above the black curve. So some servers are making more money, and here some servers are losing money. So there's wealth redistribution. So when you switch, from one type of pricing contract to another, not all the drivers are going to be happy necessarily. That's what this is showing. But if you take the integral across all the drivers, net, the welfare does increase. And so when you move to the optimal pricing mechanism, even though some drivers are worse off, net, everyone, on average, everyone's better off. Well, not on average, in aggregate, everyone's better off. So that's the core of the paper. And I want to just ask a question here, because I'm at the hour. And, I'm basically finished with the core of the paper. I can talk a little bit about what happens when you put a smart contract in the system. Or if you want to end the core talk here, we could leave that to the question part. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think, it would be interesting if you can talk about the smart contract one as well. And
okay.
And also before you move on, I want to ask one question regarding
Sure.
the previous figure. So in the previous figure, once you move to the optimal contract, actually the welfare for the lowest cost server actually decreased, right?
Right. So it depends on what curve
Okay.
curve you're going from. If you're going from the blue curve to the orange curve, or the black curve to the orange curve, your profits are going up. These are the low cost servers down here, right? So
okay,
your
then
profits
in
are
that
going
sense,
up. Yeah.
If there are multiple platform they are competing, and they want to kind of track the lowest cost server, they can have a different kind of type strategy, right? They can.
Sure.
I mean, if the current one using the a platform pricing, a new platform could use a decentralized pricing, then in that case they can attack the lowest cost server.
Yes.
Right?
Well, yeah. In this case, so this is just for certain parameters, gamma and beta. These curves can change, right? So it's not a static picture, but it depends on the market conditions. Yeah.
Okay, I see.
So I'll try to speed through this. So this paper is not really about blockchain and smart contracts, but we wanted to say something. We can still leverage the framework to say something about this. And as I mentioned, kind of in the introduction, there are a lot of startups that are trying to decentralize and disrupt. And so Arcade City and Drive are ride sharing. D-Travel is Airbnb, and Filecoin is a competitor to Dropbox. It's funny enough, Filecoin at some point last year was worth more than Dropbox. Not anymore. I think it's crashed by about 90%. But at some point, it was actually had a bigger market cap than all of Dropbox, even though they didn't have a working product yet. Now, each of these companies have their own business models with really interesting details that we don't at all capture, in this paper that I think are worthy of being studied. But there are some things we can do, and just one simple thing we can do is what happens when you remove the platform and you maximize, the value in the system, as opposed to maximizing the platform's profit. And that's, in theory, a smart contract should be able to replicate that. So when we do that and we resolve the model, so you take the platform out of the picture completely, you maximize, the value in the system, you end up with the same result, meaning it's the same type of contract structure, this commission plus per unit fee. It's still optimal, even when you remove the platform and you decentralize everything, except it's going to be different parameters. It's no longer the same commission, no longer the same fee that you have to set. And if you do that, you get about 33% more value. And this is kind of the holy grail of blockchain. This is what the promise is. And I think it's interesting because it not only increases the value in the system, but the users themselves have more control if they set their own prices. Now, is it actually implementable? Well, this is a big debate because in general, it's difficult to interface blockchain systems with real data from the outside world, non-blockchain data, which is what you need in this type of startup. And so what are these startups actually doing at the moment? They're not doing this. They're not doing commission first per unit fee contracts. They're doing something much simpler, which is in the table down here. And here is just the classical centralized platforms that we all know. And this is the commission rates that they charge. And this is the decentralized platforms. They set commission rates to 0 for the most part. So D-Travel has a 7%, but it turns out it's redistributed to the users of the system. So it's not kept by D-Travel itself. So it's as if it's 0 as well, in some sense. So we can do that. We can just set the commission to 0 in the model and resolve and see what happens. And you get the red curve if you do that. So this picture has, so the orange curve is with the platform in the picture, what's using the best possible contract it can use, normalized to 1, you get these types of profits. If you remove the platform, you switch to a blockchain system, and you implement just decentralized pricing, you get the red curve with a zero commission. So the fact that there's 0 commission here, right, leaves more profits to the servers. But there's the problem of the sides, right? In bad markets, there's not enough drivers or too many drivers, the market's going to collapse. So, so blockchain can bring some value by removing the middleman, but it cannot fix the coordination problems, at least the way they're being implemented now. This is the ideal setting in blue. If you could remove the intermediary and implement the right contract structure, you get this 33% boost in value without the coordination inefficiencies. But keep in mind, take the blue line with a grain of salt, because it's really the most ideal setting, and all sorts of practical limits could stop you from achieving that, including the ability to observe the market conditions. Because underlying all this is the assumption that you can actually observe the degree of competition in the market, and the degree of competition, not just between the drivers, but between the different platforms that you're competing against. So, so the main takeaway here is that, blockchain can help, there's some promise, but you have to be a little bit careful, because by itself, it doesn't fix some of the fundamental economic issues that you're facing in these types of platforms. Are there any questions on the blockchain part? Okay. So in this case, I can just recap. And I know there's been a lot, right? So there's a lot of content. You know, I at the very least, maybe this is saying the bar too low, but I hope that I've managed to convince you of the importance of this question of pricing control, whether it should be centralized or decentralized, and how it connects to regulatory issues. You know, I think it's an interesting question. We don't know that much, at least from when it comes to the platform setting. So I think it merits more study. And the paper, just keep in mind, it really focuses on one trade-off, which is the trade-off between, you know, centralized pricing suffers from information asymmetry because you can't observe, the platform can't observe certain things about its workers. But if you decentralize, then you have coordination problems, you know, in some types of markets. And, you know, trying to resolve this trade-off. So the main insights are there, well, either one could win. So that means that, you know, neither is robust when markets change. But at least, you know, within the confines of the model, it seems that you could implement decentralized pricing if you start tweaking the contract structure. And a small tweak here, which is just a per unit fee plus commission, as long as they're both optimally set, can actually fully replicate the optimal contract that you get from mechanism design and explore the entire space of possible contracts. I didn't mention this much, but there is robustness in the sense that this trade-off is there, right? Whether you implement blockchain or not, that same trade-off is going to continue to hold. And so you have to find a way to deal with it. And we've also done a bunch of robustness checks on the model, you know, things like, you know, changing the uniform distribution. What if you take a general distribution of costs in the market that, you know, you actually move away from some of the closed forms, and this contract here, that's this affine structure, is not necessarily 100% optimal, but in all the kind of numerical studies we have in the paper, it seems to be like 98 to 99% optimal, even when you have these really weird demand distributions, or so not demand distributions, cost distributions. And it's robust to other extensions, like what if you add capacity constraints? A really interesting comment earlier. You know, if you add capacity constraints, you kind of dampen this destructive Bertrand type of competition effect. But you know, you still get some effect there. And yeah. So yeah, so that's it. I'm happy to take questions.
So my feeling is that, you know, during the rainy days or during the rush hours, well, when riders are willing to tip more, tip the drivers more, or they are willing to call a more expensive vehicle compared with the initial type of vehicle they requested. So in this situation, I mean, when the consumers have a willingness to pay more, then if, for example, we grant the drivers such flexibility to change the prices, allow the taxi drivers or Uber drivers to change the price or charge the price, this should be better in such a situation. This should be better from the compound of view to increase the welfare instead of letting the platform set a fixed price P, right?
Yeah.
So
it's possible. Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you.
And in this situation, I'm wondering, so it's somehow related with gamma, but not completely related with gamma. I mean, when in a situation when the demand curve is nearly vertical or has a pretty high slope, is it possible to have such an effect that in a decentralized economy, well, the shape of this line is not like an inverse U shape, like it's like a U shape. In this situation, for example, the optimality happens when gamma is very high. I mean,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. yeah, in this model, no.
Yeah, right. In this situation, no.
But it's possible. Yeah, I could see.
Right.
I could see that happening potentially. Yeah. I guess I don't know for certain. I don't have a model off the top of my head that would immediately produce that result.
Yeah, that's just a vague intuition or vague feeling. It's not very straightforward proof, but my feeling is that when we grant the drivers to change the price, and especially when the customers are willing to tip more, then well, you give them more freedom, then it's more consistent with the econ principle.
Yeah, it's possible. The danger is that prices, are set at levels that are just too high, and then if there are multiple platforms competing, maybe customers go to another platform, right?
Yeah, the reason to the bottom is I think if, for example, there are taxi firms and taxi firms itself act like a moderator or intermediator to racing to the bottom situation.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I mean, it's a very, it's a critical decision that platforms have to make. But the problem is, I don't think, there are some people in the channel that might know better than me, but maybe I just don't think it's plausible for platforms to switch from one mode to another, right, on the fly. And that's kind of the big problem here, is that you kind of have to commit to something. Because it's also confusing, it's not just confusing for the drivers when you say, okay, well now, because, we have an event today, you're going to set your own prices. You can't do long-term planning. There's uncertainty, and people hate uncertainty in general. It's also more volatility for customers, because I didn't talk about volatility of prices at all, because, there's price dispersion. How much volatility do customers see? Because it's not just the average price. It's like, if there's too much variation, customers might be sensitive to the variation in prices, not just average price, right? If I take Uber today, it's $10 to get to work, but tomorrow it's 40, and then the next day it's 11, but the day after that it's 35. It's not a good feeling, right? This uncertainty. So there's all sorts of things that also, from a behavioral perspective, that would come into play in practice when it comes to making these decisions. And what's interesting is that there's some sort of a dichotomy in practice, meaning some platforms have fully decentralized pricing, or at least partially decentralized, like Airbnb. And other platforms like Uber, they, for the most part, they prefer to keep centralized control. And so it's not obvious why that's the case. There's, in this paper, towards the end, in the robustness checks, there's a hypothesis that has to do with how differentiated, so the quality of the service that every server is providing can explain some of that. But that's another interesting question, is why is it that there's this dichotomy in practice? It could just be, well, you have to stick to something, you have to make some decision and kind of stick to it. So yeah, I think there's a lot of open questions here that are really interesting for follow-up work.
Yeah, thanks.
Other questions? First, speaker.
Hi, I have a quick question. So I was wondering, in your work along the lines, because you mentioned the information efficiency, when I'm reading your setting, when I look at your settings, it seems that in the decentralized pricing cases, there is another layer of the information problem. That is, I always feel that the platform would have more information compared to the decentralized drivers, more information about the consumers. So in your model, that will maybe translated to the case where the platform have better knowledge about the gamma, or the value of the gamma and the beta. So I'm wondering whether in your line of work, have you considered that type of settings, and how if we consider where the information is not. So when we consider decentralized pricing, the dispersion of the information regarding the consumers. So what would happen in that case?
Yeah, that's a great point. So the model does assume that everyone knows how demand is behaving. So they can read, the customer demand. We thought about it a little bit. When we started this model, we were trying to understand what are some of the fundamental things that could be driving this choice. And, this was one of them, right? Imagine the platform has a better view of the state of market demand at a given point in time, which it might, right? Because it collects requests from all customers at the same time from different areas. So what would happen then? Well, what would happen then, I think it's kind of easy to predict that, centralized pricing would go up and decentralized pricing would go down. And so you'd want to decentralize less. But, so from a modeling, I think that's kind of clear. What's less clear, or what would happen, right? What's less clear is, there are still companies that might have better information that still do decentralized pricing. Like, for instance, Airbnb. And so you could argue the same argument, well, Uber has better customer information. Well, you could argue Airbnb has better demand information than a given person with his or her apartment, right? And so why do they do decentralized pricing? So, so that's why I think it's not the only point of consideration. In the case of Airbnb, what's interesting is that it's a hybrid approach, right? It's basically, look, you get to decide the price, but I get to decide the fee, and of course, and they also provide guidance, right? They say, look, we believe at the moment, for these days of the week, you could price your apartment here, and you'd have some probability of getting it booked, right? So that's not, it's not necessarily cheap talk. As an asset owner, that might be useful information, but then it opens an entirely other door, which is, well, can I be manipulated via the information that Airbnb is giving me, right? Is that information in my best interest, or is the information in Airbnb's best interest? And so that's a whole other question. There's some literature on disclosure and information and cheap talk on platform settings that this paper doesn't touch on. But when we started thinking about that, the platform has better information, but what if it tries to communicate that information? It opened up this entire new can of worms, which is, well, okay, this is an entirely other paper with cheap talk, and do you trust or not trust, and do you manipulate, do you not manipulate, all that stuff. So definitely very interesting though. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Gerry. Can I ask one kind of follow-up question on the previous point I just mentioned about? So here in this, in your model, the platform only make two choice, maybe price and commission fees, right? So, but in the reality, when we think about Uber or Lyft, the majority of tasks they're doing is like to match the seller, the drivers and the consumers. Yeah. In that case, they're actually like determine the demand curve, right, for each drivers. In that case, if the whole demand curve can be controlled by the platform, maybe for each particular driver, how will that change your model? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. So the matching is obviously a very important part of what these platforms do, but so is pricing. Yeah. Now, the difficulty is that in practice, these things are not unrelated. Now they might operate. So I haven't worked at Uber, right? And I haven't worked at Uber throughout the various iterations, Uber now versus Uber, 5 years ago. I have to guess that at some point these two functions were completely separated. I don't necessarily think that the pricing team was working 100% together with the matching team. I don't know what the situation currently is, but yes, ideally you want to have some holistic approach to this. The reality, I just haven't seen, I think it's a very complicated problem, but I just haven't seen a lot of papers that do both. Maybe a couple off the top of my head, but I haven't seen a lot of papers that try to do both at the same time. But you're right that this is definitely, it should not be separated from the fact that you can actually control. You can control these parameters by controlling the demand, and the matching.
Yeah, and also another question is that at the very beginning you mentioned about the regulatory concerns about whether or not to give the pricing kind of power to the servers. But in your model, you don't really have that, right? So, so what if you add the regulatory concern in your model? How will that change your result or your model?
So right, so we don't have what we have in the model, right, in this decentralized setting is, this is the server's ability to fully set their own prices independently, right? So we have that part, but we don't have the benefit that the platform would get from. But in theory, you could think of, it's a really good point, right? You could think of, well, if I get an extra benefit, I can take the whole blue curve and push it up. Because if I get an extra benefit, so or save costs, which would increase my profit by not having to reclassify, you can think of reclassification as a fixed, maybe a fixed, I don't know, maybe it's not, maybe it's not really fixed, but as an approximation, you can think of it as a fixed cost that you could just add it. So it would be in favor, it would be an extra saving that you get if you decentralize. So you want to move more towards, so these two opposite effects, right? So one is that the mentioned earlier was that, well, actually the platform might have better information that kind of is against decentralization. And then this effect that you're mentioning, where you actually get extra benefits because you don't have to reclassify, so you get more. so maybe they offset or something. But yeah, so you're right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
Any other questions? Yeah, if there's no, actually, can I ask you the last question? Yeah, a little bit unrelated to paper, but related about the blockchain. I always amazed by those kind of the blockchain technology. The firm, for example, that the ride sharing platform, they say they're gonna win the Uber, right?
Yeah.
But I always think that price is also very important, some strategy of the platform, but also other kind of stuff like a quality, other kind of stuff that the platform can control as a centralized the figure is actually very important, some source of their competitiveness. So I just wonder, because you are experts in those academia and also worked at some industry, how much do they actually, the platforms, Uber and Lyft, like those kind of big platforms, think these blockchain technology platforms as a real threat? Because if your blockchain technology is the platform, so one of the big kind of the lack of your power is you're not going to be able to make that kind of the centralized decision, right?
No. So I don't know how they think. I don't know how seriously they're taking this threat at the moment.
Yeah.
Let me just say a couple of quick thoughts here. So I think it's very difficult for blockchain startups to launch in this space, because you have the traditional problem of, how do you get enough drivers? How do you get enough customers at the same time? Without, you basically have to subsidize the whole thing. And so where is that money going to come from? So my gut is that these startups are probably operating in these types of markets where there's too many drivers, or probably not enough drivers. Either way, if there's too much hype, or if there's not enough, which is probably down here, I don't think they're operating in good markets. so the inability to get enough supply on the platform means they're in this regime here, and this is just complete failure. And that's why it's very difficult for them to actually compete. Now, that's one of the reasons. The other reason is the technology side itself, because you need to implement matching, pricing, data, all those things that you need. You have to implement all that stuff in the right way, and that's hard. It's difficult to do. So you have the traditional problem that all platforms have, which is how do you actually get people on the platform, and then on top of that you have the technology problems. How do you actually write the smart contracts, design the contracts, and there's an entire other layer to this, which is there's no commission fee, but there's a token system behind all these platforms. And so who benefits by owning the token, right? It must be the case that the founders, unless they're doing it completely, pro bono, if it's like a Wikipedia type of situation, that might be a little different. But a lot of blockchain startups, they're launching their startups. One of the goals is to make some profit and make some money, right? And so if they're not going to make it through the commission contract, then they're going to have to make it through the token appreciation, and that takes value away from the system, right? So it's not clear that in that case, are we really that different than having a central entity or not? So it depends on how the token system is implemented. So all these things are, I think, open questions. And at the moment, I don't think Uber's very concerned. But from my personal opinion, long term, the technology is a little bit scary. For traditional centralized platforms, I'd be a little bit worried. I'd definitely be curious because it has all the ingredients that are necessary. But can you bring them? Yeah.
I always thought that even after the technology develops, enabling them to have some perfect matching, I think this core competitiveness of the platform is coming from that centralized decision of the platform. Yeah, it's my personal opinion. So I just always wondered.
It's possible, but I think that can be replicated. Some of it can be replicated. Like demand information could be centralized via smart contract in theory and distributed across the system. And contracts could be made to reflect the state of the market at any given point. They could be made dynamic.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Rio. Yeah, any other question? I think if there is one, that will be the last one.
So I had a kind of an intuitive question, and I apologize because I was connection issues. I was in and out. But is there a difference between I think intuitively of a few of these networks like Airbnb versus Uber? In Airbnb, the consumers are much more discriminatory. Like people spend a lot of time looking through the Airbnb they're going to book. But for some of these platforms like Uber, I really, I might select the size of the vehicle, but at the end of the day, if a vehicle comes, that kind of fulfills my expectations. So I'm just wondering whether, that changes the degree to which decentralization and, your model, your solutions affect the value of that platform using, a blockchain solution.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. That's exactly what we were thinking as well. And so we added a small part to the paper at the end in the robustness section that looks exactly at this. So we have to make some approximations, but essentially we looked at, what happens if servers with higher quality can bring in more customers, which is very similar, it's similar to what you're saying. And that's exactly, it goes the way of your intuition, which basically says where quality matters a lot, it actually makes sense to decentralize. And when it doesn't matter so much, like for Uber, it makes more sense to keep it centralized. But I didn't want to overclaim because it's a small part of the paper and there's some approximations in that section and things like that. But I think I share your intuition on that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you to the speaker for the amazing talk, and also thank you for the audience for the participation. Yeah. We have another seminar for, in 2 weeks later. So I hope everybody can join that too. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks again for all the comments
you.
and the invitation. Bye.